I have spent decades reading case files that smell like iron and dust. Files that carry the weight of lives destroyed, families shattered, and choices that cannot be undone. But when I first opened the folder labeled Aaron Joseph Hernandez, I felt something I rarely feel, an uncomfortable hesitation. Because this wasn't just another criminal. This was a man America once held up like a trophy. A man whose rise was so meteoric that his fall seemed almost impossible. Yet here he was, on my desk, reduced to a stack of statements, autopsy photos, surveillance screenshots, phone extractions, and fragments of a life that spiraled into darkness. Before the crime, before the cameras captured his wrists in cold steel, before the courtroom lights erased the stadium lights, he once lived under, Aaron Hernandez was something else entirely. He was a hero to many, a prodigy, a force of nature molded by talent, discipline, and the brutal poetry of football. That is where this story begins, because no tragedy begins at the moment of the crime. It begins long before, in the quiet fractures that spread under the surface. Aaron was born in Bristol, Connecticut, a small town with big dreams and bigger shadows. His father, Dennis Hernandez, known as the king around the neighborhood, was a towering figure in Aaron's life. He coached him hard, celebrated him harder, and punished him hardest. People who knew Dennis said he demanded excellence, but what he truly demanded was fear. Aaron learned early that pain was a language and silence was survival. He respected his father, yes, but he also feared him so deeply that the fear etched itself into the architecture of his mind. As a detective, I've learned that trauma doesn't just hurt, it shapes, it sculpts, and sometimes it carves out pieces that can never be replaced. Aaron idolized his father, but he also inherited his rage. That rage would later become a ghost, following him through locker rooms, nightclubs, and eventually the crime scene that changed everything. When Aaron was 16, his father died unexpectedly from complications during a routine surgery. That was the moment everything cracked. His mother remarried too quickly to a man involved in criminal activities. Arguments erupted at home. Trust evaporated. The structure that Dennis had imposed, harsh as it was, collapsed overnight. Aaron was left drifting, wounded, and furious. A teenager with the body of a man, the talent of a star, and the emotional foundation of a boy who had lost the only person he was ever afraid to disappoint. At the University of Florida, he became a standout tight end under coach Urban Meyer. But beneath the highlight reels and roaring crowds, Hernandez cultivated a dual life. On the field, he was relentless. Off the field, he was volatile. There were bar fights, threats, suspicious incidents involving guns. The university smoothed many of them over. Talented players often found themselves protected by the invisible hands of success. But every time the consequences were avoided, Aaron learned a dangerous lesson that his talent was stronger than accountability. Watching footage from those years, I see a young man running full speed, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually, as if he knew something was chasing him, as if slowing down meant facing it. When the New England Patriots drafted him in 2010, it looked like redemption. Bill Belichick, the architect of dynasties, took a chance on him. They offered discipline, structure, mentorship, and for a while it worked. Hernandez signed a $40 million contract extension. Reporters praised him as proof that troubled youth could be transformed at the highest level of sport. But here is something I've learned from every case I've ever worked on. No one outruns their demons forever, especially not the ones that were raised with them. Behind the gates of his mansion in North Attleboro, Hernandez began building a circle of friends who were not teammates, not mentors, not professionals. They were men from his past, men tied to street life, men who brought out the impulsive darkness he had carried since childhood. The more fame he gained, the more paranoid he became. Success made him visible, and visibility made him feel hunted. He installed indoor surveillance cameras long before the crime. He bought weapons with the same nonchalance most people buy groceries. He smoked weed daily to calm a brain that doctors would later discover was severely damaged, ravaged by years of brutal hits to the head. There were warning signs everywhere. He became explosively jealous. He reacted violently to minor tensions. He distanced himself from teammates and gravitated toward people who fueled his distrust. The Patriots saw glimpses. The league saw glimpses. But no one saw the full picture until it was too late. And then came Odin Lloyd. To understand the tragedy that unfolded, you must understand this. Odin wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a rival. He wasn't even an enemy. He was practically family. The boyfriend of the sister of Hernandez's fiancée, Cheyenne, a quiet, disciplined, semi-pro football player trying to build a life. There was no clear reason for animosity, none that made sense on paper. But human behavior doesn't follow clean lines. And Aaron Hernandez was a man living inside a storm. On the night of June 16, 2013, something shifted. Something snapped. And a decision was made that would end one life and unravel another. But to explain how that night unfolded, we must walk through the hours, minutes, and shadows that led to it. And that is where part 2 begins, because the night of the murder did not start at the crime scene. It started inside the mind of a man who had spent years spiraling toward a moment he could neither escape nor undo. This is the rise before the fall, the quiet before the gunfire, the making of a man who would soon lose everything. And as I turn the page of this file, the darkness deepens. When I turn to part 2 of this case file, I enter the hours before the murder. Hours thick with tension, with unanswered questions, with moments that in hindsight feel like alarms ringing in an empty room. The night Odin Lloyd died wasn't born from chaos. It was crafted minute by minute, decision by decision, inside the fractured mind of Aaron Hernandez. To understand that night, you must understand the state of mind Hernandez carried with him. He lived in a world built from contradictions. The mansion in North Attleboro was beautiful, immaculate, secure. But inside it, Hernandez cultivated a sense of danger, a feeling that he was always being watched, judged, or betrayed. The more successful he became, the more suspicious he grew. His phone was locked constantly. His conversations were short, clipped, defensive. He monitored people the way criminals monitor police. In his own home, he walked around with a firearm tucked into his waistband, even when holding his infant daughter. I've seen paranoia before, but this wasn't the kind that comes from delusion. This came from experience, from trauma, from living in environments where trust could get you killed. Aaron wasn't afraid of imaginary threats. He was afraid of real ones, and he believed that the only way to neutralize danger was to strike first. On June 16, 2013, hours before the murder, something small happened between Hernandez and Odin Lloyd, something no witness could fully explain. Some said Lloyd had spoken about information he shouldn't have. Others said Hernandez felt Lloyd had embarrassed him at a nightclub 2 nights prior, talking to people Hernandez didn't approve of. Whatever the truth was, it triggered the one thing Hernandez could never control, the fear that someone close to him would betray him. When I reviewed the timeline, it struck me how methodical the events were. At 9:00 p.m., Hernandez texted 2 of his closest associates, Carlos Ortiz and Ernest Wallace. His message was cryptic, but unmistakably commanding. You know what to do. They understood. They always did. The two men drove toward Hernandez's home in a silver Nissan Altima rental car. Cameras captured the car, passing through neighborhoods, streetlights, reflecting off the windshield like flashes of warning. At 12:30 p.m. a.m., they arrived at the mansion. Hernandez greeted them with an intensity visible, even without sound. He walked ahead, pacing, gesturing. The footage showed him going into the basement and reappearing with a firearm. Not waving it, holding it like it was part of him. As I watched the footage, I noticed something. Hernandez wasn't smiling, wasn't joking. His face was blank, rigid, the face of a man who had already made a decision. At 1 o'clock a.m., Hernandez got back into the Altima with Ortiz and Wallace. They drove into Boston to pick up Odin Lloyd. Lloyd didn't look scared when he entered the car. He thought he was with friends, with family, almost. The cameras at his home showed him jogging to the car. He didn't know it was the last car he would ever ride in. As they drove back toward North Attleboro, text messages mapped out a silent desperation. Lloyd texted his sister at 3:22 a.m. "Did you see who I'm with?" When she asked who, he replied, "NFL." She didn't respond. This small moment, so heartbreakingly human, is what stays with me. Lloyd sensed something was wrong. Not enough to run, not enough to fight, just enough to feel a coldness spreading through him. Enough to reach out, but not enough to escape. The Altima turned onto an isolated industrial road just minutes from Hernandez's mansion. There were no streetlights, no traffic, no witnesses. The perfect place to end a life. Based on forensic evidence, the sequence was swift. Lloyd stepped out of the car. He turned. A shot fired into his back. He fell to his knees, gasping. 4 more bullets tore through him, each one deliberate, each one shattering bone and muscle. He collapsed into the dirt. The silence of the night swallowed the last seconds of his life. The car sped away. Later, when I revisited the scene, I remember the overwhelming stillness. Not a dramatic crime scene with chaos, not a struggle, just a quiet, lonely patch of gravel where a man's life ended violently. The tragedy of it felt suffocating. Back at Hernandez's home, the cameras captured him returning at 3:30 a.m. He entered holding what appeared to be the same gun he had earlier. He walked into the basement, shirtless now, appearing both agitated and strangely calm. At one point, he danced, a hollow, disconnected dance, as if he were trying to shake the night off his skin. From years of investigating homicides, I've learned that killers often behave in unpredictable ways after the act. Some hide, some break down, some deny. But others, like Hernandez, move through the motions of normalcy, almost as if convincing themselves that nothing has happened. It's not arrogance, it's shock, a psychological freeze. But evidence does not freeze. Evidence moves forward. The next morning, Lloyd's body was discovered. The police traced footprints, tire marks, cell tower pings, surveillance footage, and like threads woven into a single rope, everything pointed toward Hernandez. When I analyze the hours after the murder, what stands out is Hernandez's reaction. He destroyed his home security system's hard drive, smashed it into pieces. He destroyed his phone. He hired a cleaning crew for the house, all within hours. These weren't the actions of a man blindsided by tragedy. These were the actions of a man who knew exactly what he had done. In interviews, Hernandez spoke calmly, too calmly. He denied everything, but when I watched him, I saw the restlessness, the tapping fingers, the darting eyes, the forced casualness. This wasn't the confidence of innocence. This was the urgency of someone trying to outrun time. Investigators found a blunt behind his house with Hernandez's DNA. Shell casings matched casings inside his car. text messages filled the gaps. The story assembled itself piece by piece, and behind every piece was the same haunting truth. The murder wasn't impulsive. It wasn't accidental. It was the result of paranoia, of distrust, of a man who believed violence was the only language he could rely on. When I stepped away from the file that night, I realized something. This wasn't the climax of the story. This was the midpoint, the true unraveling. The trial, the revelations, the psychological collapse was still ahead. Part 3 begins not at the crime scene, but in the courtroom, where the world finally saw the two sides of Aaron Hernandez collide, the athlete and the killer, the hero and the menace, the man he was and the man he became. And in that courtroom, the truth burned brighter than the stadium lights he once thrived under. Trials have a way of stripping people down. No matter how powerful, how wealthy, how adored someone once was, the courtroom turns them into something brutally equal, a defendant. When Aaron Hernandez stepped into the Bristol County Superior Court with shackles around his wrists and a suit tailored as if trying to remember the man he used to be, the world saw a collision. The athlete and the killer, the hero and the menace, the man he performed for the public, and the man hidden in the shadows of his private life. Both identities walked into that courtroom, but only one of them would walk out alive. I remember watching the footage of his first arraignment. The courtroom was overflowing with reporters, families of victims, and curious onlookers who still couldn't comprehend how a man with a $40 million contract could be tied to a brutal execution-style killing. Hernandez sat rigid, jaw clenched, eyes darting, but not with confusion, more with calculation. He wasn't processing guilt or innocence. He was assessing the room, assessing the enemy, assessing the damage. Trials are battles, but they're battles of narrative. The prosecution builds a story. The defense counters that story, and the jury decides which version of reality becomes legally true. And in this case, reality was about to be dissected piece by piece. The prosecution's opening argument was a surgical strike. They presented Hernandez not as a gifted athlete with momentary lapses, but as a man leading a double life, one foot on the football field, the other in a world of paranoia, violence, and impulsive decisions. They laid out the timeline with precision, showing the rental car footage, the text messages, the surveillance inside the mansion, the destroyed phone, the smashed DVR, and the shoe prints near the crime scene. Each point was a thread, and together they formed a web Hernandez could not crawl out of. But the true weight came from motive, a word that, in this case, was both clear and hazy. The prosecution argued that Hernandez murdered Odin Lloyd because Lloyd knew something damaging, something Hernandez feared more than prison, more than shame, more than death. And fear, when it corrodes the mind long enough, becomes a storm that consumes logic. The defense crafted a different story. They didn't deny Hernandez was with Lloyd that night. They didn't deny the timeline. They didn't deny the friendship. Instead, they attacked the reliability of circumstantial evidence, insisting that nothing placed the gun in Hernandez's hand at the moment of the shooting. They painted Ortiz and Wallace, the two men with violent histories, as the real killers. They argued that Hernandez was guilty of poor decisions, not murder. But logic wasn't on their side. Circumstantial evidence in isolation may be fragile, but woven together, it forms iron. I spent months reviewing court transcripts, watching body language, pausing frame by frame to read what the eyes revealed. Hernandez was stoic most of the time. Too stoic. When the prosecution played footage of him walking into his home, holding what appeared to be the murder weapon, he didn't flinch. When they showed texts between him and Lloyd, He swallowed hard but quickly regained composure. But the moment that told me everything came when Lloyd's mother took the stand. She spoke with the quiet strength of someone who had lived her whole life fighting for her children. Her voice was steady, but her grief was visible in every syllable. When she described her son's smile, Hernandez lowered his gaze, not out of respect, but because eye contact would have broken the walls he was desperately trying to keep standing. I've seen killers break in front of grieving mothers before. Hernandez didn't break, but he cracked. During the trial, one piece of evidence emerged like a hammer to glass: the discovery of .45 caliber shell casings inside the rental car that matched casings found at the crime scene. That was not coincidence. That was not speculation. That was the gun speaking from beyond the grave. Still, the most damning evidence wasn't physical. It was psychological. Hernandez's obsession with security, the cameras, the guns, the paranoia, the isolation, the destructive behaviors. These traits formed a coherent pattern, revealing a man whose mind was spiraling long before the murder. The jury wasn't just evaluating a crime. They were staring into the unraveling of a human being. On April 15, 2015, the verdict came guilty of first-degree murder. Mandatory life sentence without the possibility of parole. The courtroom didn't erupt. It froze. Time stopped. Hernandez showed almost no emotion. His fiancée cried. His mother gasped. Wallace bowed his head. Ortiz stared into space. Hernandez stood motionless, as if the verdict did nothing more than confirm the ending he had already anticipated. I watched frame by frame. His eyes barely shifted. His jaw flexed once. His shoulders tightened, then relaxed. It was the expression of a man who had lived with this outcome in his mind long before a jury spoke it aloud. A man who had never truly believed he was untouchable, despite acting like he was. But trials don't just expose guilt, they expose truth. And the truth is that Hernandez wasn't simply a criminal. He was broken, a product of violence, a man sculpted by trauma, reinforced by fame, and destroyed by fear. And yet, even with the verdict delivered, this case wasn't over. Because behind the bars, a storm was beginning to form, one that would lead to another twist, another death, and another revelation that would shock the medical world and redefine the legacy of a fallen NFL star. Part 4 begins in a cell and ends in a morgue. Between those 2 points lies a truth darker than any crime scene. A prison cell has a way of shrinking a man's world down to its barest truth. 4 walls, a metal bed, a toilet, a narrow slit of a window that offers a fraction of the sky. Many men break inside that box. Some become violent, others numb, and a few, very few, become haunted by the echoes of who they once were. Aaron Hernandez fell into the last category. When he entered the Souza Baranowski Correctional Center, he arrived not as an NFL star, not as a millionaire, not as a public figure. He entered as inmate W106228, stripped of status, stripped of control, stripped of the world he once commanded with his athletic brilliance. The cheers of the stadium were replaced by the clanging of cell doors and the murmurs of other inmates calling out his name, not with admiration, with curiosity, with judgment, with the cold fascination of men who finally see a celebrity reduced to their level. I have studied many men after conviction. Some adapt quickly. Others resist reality until it crushes them. Hernandez existed somewhere in between. He worked out obsessively, as if clinging to the only part of himself he still recognized. He played the tough guy. He laughed loudly in the yard. He made jokes cracked smiles. He behaved like a man determined not to crumble, but beneath the surface, his mind had already begun to fracture. Inmates reported that he spent long hours staring at the wall. Sometimes he mumbled to himself. Sometimes he paced the cell in the dark. Sometimes he wrote cryptic notes in the margins of books. He avoided speaking about the trial, avoided speaking about Lloyd, avoided speaking about the future. Denial is not a strategy. It is a slow poison. The strange thing was that Hernandez continued to fight legally. He still believed there was a path forward. His lawyers appealed. He prepared for another unrelated trial, and for a brief moment, it looked like he might win a small victory. On April 14, 2017, he was acquitted in a double homicide case from Boston. The courtroom reacted with shock. Hernandez smiled a rare, genuine smile, the smile of a man who believed he had turned a corner. But sometimes a smile means hope, and sometimes it means goodbye. When I look back at the timeline, the hours after the acquittal feel eerie, like the calm before a storm no one sees coming. Hernandez called his daughter, laughed. He called his fiancée, spoke about the future. He returned to his cell and played cards with other inmates. Guards said he seemed relaxed, too relaxed. April 19, 2017, 3:05 a.m. A correctional officer walked down the tier. Most inmates were asleep. Hernandez's cell door was closed, the window blocked with cardboard. Nothing unusual. Until the officer called his name. No response. Another call. Silence. When the door opened, the officer froze. Aaron Hernandez was hanging from a bedsheet tied to the window bars, his feet slightly off the ground. A Bible open to John 3:16 a.m. near the bed. The words written in ink on his forehead, John 3:16 a.m. Another note, I love you, Shay. I have seen death scenes in every form: violence, overdoses, natural causes. But this one was different. Quiet, intentional, symbolic. A final act performed by a man who once lived with unstoppable force. He left 3 letters, one for his daughter, one for his fiancée, one for an unknown friend. Each letter carried a tone of acceptance, as if he believed death was not the end, but a release. Speculation spread quickly. Was it suicide? Was he coerced? Was it a message? Was it defeat? Or was it the final move of a man who no longer recognized himself? When I reviewed every detail, every timeline entry, every interview with inmates and guards, the conclusion was unavoidable. Aaron Hernandez took his own life. But he did not do it in despair. He did it in resignation. And yet, even death wasn't the final twist. A few months later, the brain of Aaron Hernandez was examined by neuropathologists at Boston University. The findings were shocking. His brain showed stage 3 CTE, one of the most advanced forms ever seen in someone his age. A brain ravaged by repeated trauma. A brain deteriorated in ways usually found in elderly patients with dementia. A brain incapable of regulating impulse, emotion, fear, and aggression. When I held the report in my hands, I understood something painful. The man responsible for Odin Lloyd's death was also a victim of a lifetime of hits, concussions, and unseen damage. This does not excuse him, but it explains him. The collapse of Aaron Hernandez was not the work of a single night. It was decades in the making. A perfect storm of childhood trauma, fame, physical damage, pressure, paranoia, and choices that slowly erased the line between reality and fear. The world looked at him and saw a monster. But the truth is never simple. He was a man shaped by violence long before he ever committed it. Part 4 ends with Hernandez lying cold in a prison cell and his brain stored in a laboratory. But the story is not over, because the fallout, the lawsuits, the debates, the legacy, the families on both sides, and the question of who Aaron Hernandez truly was still echoes today. Part 5 will close this case and reveal the last unanswered question: was Aaron Hernandez born to fall or built to break? Every case ends with a file being closed, a label applied, a signature signed, pages pressed together and sealed. But some cases don't end when the ink dries. Some remain alive, breathing in the questions they leave behind. The case of Aaron Hernandez is one of those. Even now, long after his death, the echoes of his choices and the shadows of his past linger in courtrooms, in laboratories, in living rooms where families still grieve, and in stadiums where fans still wonder how a life so powerful could collapse so completely. When I look back on this investigation, I don't see a simple arc of a man who lived, sinned, and died. I see intersections. Violence intersecting with vulnerability. Trauma intersecting with talent. Brain damage intersecting with fame. A story not of a monster, but of a man shaped by pressures he couldn't understand and impulses he couldn't control. After Hernandez's death, the fallout began immediately. Lawsuits from Lloyd's family, lawsuits from Hernandez's own family. The NFL came under fire. The Patriots faced criticism for enabling behavior they allegedly ignored. The legal world debated whether Hernandez's conviction should be vacated under an old Massachusetts law that clears convictions when the convicted dies before the appeals process is complete. For a short time, the court did vacate his conviction, pulling him out of guilty and returning him technically to innocence. But that decision was later overturned, reinstating the verdict. To the public, these legal twists seemed like confusion, but to those of us who have investigated tragedies like this, they were symptoms of a deeper issue. No one knew who Aaron Hernandez really was: a hero, a villain, a victim, or all three. The CTE diagnosis forced everyone to rethink their assumptions. Doctors who studied his brain said it was one of the most severe cases they'd ever seen in someone under 30. The frontal lobes, responsible for judgment, planning, emotional regulation, were damaged beyond repair. The amygdala, responsible for fear and aggression, was swollen and overactive. A mind physically incapable of slowing down impulses. A mind wired for fear, distrust, and explosive reactions. A mind deteriorating quietly while the world cheered his every touchdown. When I read that report, I felt something shift. It didn't erase the crime. It didn't excuse the choices. Odin Lloyd was still dead. His family was still broken. Hernandez still pulled the trigger, but it revealed what I had sensed throughout this investigation. This wasn't a story of pure evil. This was a story of a storm created by childhood trauma, fueled by the brutality of professional sports, intensified by fame, and worsened by a brain degenerating from the inside out. In the weeks after Hernandez's death, I interviewed people who knew him: teammates, coaches, teachers, childhood friends. What struck me was how consistently contradictory their memories were. Some described him as warm, generous, charismatic. Others described him as cold, unpredictable, intimidating. Some saw the smile, others saw the glare. But nearly all agreed on one thing: he was two people, even when he didn't want to be. That duality became the heart of the public debate. Was Aaron Hernandez responsible for his actions? Yes, legally, absolutely. But was he fully aware of how broken he was? That question is harder and darker. The truth is that sometimes we don't recognize the cracks until the whole structure collapses. The NFL tightened concussion protocols after his case. researchers accelerated their studies on CTE. Families of players began questioning whether the sport they loved was silently destroying the minds of the men who played it. Hernandez became a symbol not of greatness, not of tragedy alone, but of the terrifying possibility that the violence entertained on Sundays might reappear in players' lives in ways no one anticipated. Odin Lloyd's family fought for justice. They won civil judgments. But the hole left by his death is something money can never fill. They lost a son, a brother, a partner, a man who was building a future. His story is often overshadowed by the fame of the man who killed him. But in my reports, in my memory, and in this documentary, his name is carved permanently. Victims deserve more than footnotes. And then there is the Hernandez family. His daughter, his fiancée, his mother, people caught between grief and betrayal, between defending his humanity and confronting the enormity of his crimes. I remember looking at photos of his daughter in the courtroom. She didn't understand the words, she didn't understand the evidence. But she understood one thing: the man who carried her on his shoulders would never come home again. Legacy is a complicated word. It usually refers to what we leave behind. But in cases like this, legacy is also what we reveal. Aaron Hernandez revealed the cracks in a system that prioritizes performance over mental health. He revealed how fame can mask violence. He revealed how invisible brain injuries can destroy lives long before symptoms appear. He revealed the devastating consequences of untreated trauma. And perhaps most painfully, he revealed how one man's collapse can pull dozens of others down with him. As I close this file for the final time, I think about the question that haunted me from the beginning: was Aaron Hernandez born to fall or built to break? The evidence tells me this: people like him are not born broken. They are shaped, molded, sculpted by forces often larger than themselves. But at the same time, choices matter. He chose violence. He chose secrecy. He chose to pull the trigger. Fate builds the stage, but we decide how we move on it. In the end, Aaron Hernandez became both villain and victim, both cautionary tale and tragedy, both warning and wound. His story will be studied, debated, and retold for years. But as for me, I carry one truth above all: there are cases that end because justice is served, and there are cases that end because the story has nowhere left to go. This is the latter. This is where I, Detective Miller Files, close the final page and let the silence speak the rest.